On January the 6th, 1945, your 312th Bomb Group arrived on Lehti to support American forces who on the January 9th will invade Luzon, the island where Manila and the capital is situated. Meanwhile, in the European theater, the Battle of the Bulge was being fought. It was on December 16, 1944, that German forces made their surprise attack, and the fighting did not cease until January 25, 1945. For our viewers' information, a map is being shown of the Philippine Islands, and they point out there the Clark Field, which is on Luzon, and Tanawan on Lehti, approximately 300 miles away. C.W., would you now tell us about your experiences in those early days of January 1945?
Well, we had no longer, or just barely gotten to the Philippines when we started flying missions in support of the invasion of Luzon. We arrived on the 6th, and our first mission was flown on the 7th. And it was to Clark Field, which was the major Japanese airfield in the Philippines. And we were supposed to bomb and strafe and disable as many Japanese planes as we could in order to protect the forces that were to land at Luzon in a couple of days. And we continued these missions daily for the next week. After about the 3rd or 4th mission that I had flown, my airplane was badly damaged and was taken out of service for repairs, and I was given what we called a spare, which is usually a war-weary plane that had seen better service, but was on standby as a replacement for planes that had to be repaired in some way. I didn't know it at the time, but this would sort of put my life in jeopardy a little bit later. After receiving this spare plane, I was scheduled then for a second raid on Clark Field up in Luzon. And this time they were waiting for us. The first time we had surprise, and we hadn't encountered a whole lot of enemy anti-aircraft fire. But this time they hit us with everything, and they had over 100 anti-aircraft guns, plus machine guns and small arms fire, which badly damaged our whole group flying over Clark Field. I think we also damaged them very badly, but we ended up with several planes that were disabled. My plane had its radio shot out, and which meant that there was a complete lack of communication between other planes and my squadron, and also with my gunner. I couldn't even talk to my gunner on the radio because it was disabled completely. It also crippled my right engine and punctured several. The A-20 has 5 gasoline tanks, and it punctured several of those. I never did know how many. The plane, the right engine was so badly disabled that I was forced to feather the propeller, which minimized the further damage to the plane and reduced the drag. It also reduced the speed somewhat. I guess I flew almost 300 miles this way with one of my wingmen joined me as an escort to try to provide any help that he could, and also to assess any damage that he could see that I couldn't see from the cockpit.
So he was flying with you?
He was flying with me
back
on
Lehti.
The way back to home base in Lehti at Tanawan Strip. Our speed was reduced to about 170 miles an hour, and I was constantly checking my fuel, the RPM on the good engine, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, trying to make sure that nothing else went wrong. I realized after flying this way for over an hour that I was going to have to make an important decision as to what I would do in order to land the plane.
Decision time, huh?
Decision time, yeah. And there seemed to be several options. The first option was to bail out. And this really wasn't too good an option because, one, I thought it was unthinkable that I wouldn't be able to tell my gunner, Eddie, in the back that I was going to bail out. He wouldn't know until he saw me fly out the cabin of the plane that we were bailing out, which might have meant that he'd go in with the plane and to a certain death. So that was out. A second option was to fly through the low clouds over the mountains, which separated us from our airstrip. And this wasn't a very good option because a lot of those clouds had solid centers in terms of mountaintops, and even though I'd save a lot of distance by not flying around the island, I knew that that wasn't a good idea either. The third option was to land at an airstrip, Tacloban, which was about a half an hour north of my home base. And this is the first one that I decided to exercise. I decided, well, this would be the best thing I could do, would be go ahead and land while I still had gas and power. When I got opposite Tacloban, however, I could see that the planes were landing. I was flying south at the time, and the planes were landing from south to north, or just opposite my direction. And what's more, there were several of them on the final approach, and they were firing off red flares, which meant that they had wounded people on board, and therefore they had priority for landing. So I knew I'd never be able to squeeze into that landing.
That took care of that option.
That took care of that option. And about the same time as that, the left engine began to cough and sputter, and that was my final exercise, my final option. I had no choice but to land my airplane in the water off of Lehti Gulf shore, and
you'd finally be able to practice.
My first and only ditching practice. There were set procedures specified for ditching. I guess the first thing they suggested is you keep your plane flying if possible. You didn't want it to stall out like these airplanes did, that this airplane did up in New York, and crash out of control. You wanted to keep the nose down and keep flying as long as you could till you got just above the water, about 10 to 20 feet, which is very hard to judge, especially if you don't have white caps or something to help you judge the distance.